Hey folks, Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden here. And with the announcement last week of the release of an upcoming VHS movie that will have stories based off of entries on the SCP Wiki, I figured there were a few people as well positioned as myself to give a ranking of which SCP articles are likely to see an adaptation in the VHS format. Obviously, for the channel, I'm a fan of short form fiction as a medium broadly, whether it's films or the written word, but I've always had a soft spot for horror anthologies in particular. Starting with Rod Serling's two shows, The Night Gallery and The Twilight Zone, from a young age, I've always been on the lookout for anything that might serve as a spiritual successor. While VHS did not have nearly the talent pool to draw from as the early Twilight Zone episodes, it did scratch the itch of having a new series that was putting out more consistent content, in my opinion, than some of its modern competition, like the ABCs of Death, and has maintained a serialized status unlike some of the better anthologies such as Southbound or Trick or Treat. Likewise, I've been in the internet horror game since it was in its more nascent stages on message boards, including seeing the founding of the SCP Wiki in person on X. While over time, the quality of online writing has increased to the point that it rivals some of the more traditional horror magazines like Rue Morgue, that was not always the case. Thankfully, as someone pointed out in a comment on Twitter back when I covered SCP-093, many of these SCP Wiki entries are high concept enough that they've really maintained a grip on the internet's conscience. I believe that this high concept nature is what makes them a perfect candidate for adaptation. Filmmakers can take a concept that did well in capturing an audience's attention, polish away some of the tarnish that comes from the wiki's idea of a scientific tone, and potentially create one of the best entries in the VHS series. One of the recent VHS titles that had an alien-looking stork kidnapping babies and turning humans into zombies by using its beak to hollow out people's brains felt like it belonged in any number of already existing fan adaptations about mobile task forces, the SWAT-like group sent to collect dangerous phenomena in the SCP universe. So I don't think it's out of the question to believe the team working on the VHS movie is capable of creating a good SCP adaptation. The only question is what they are going to choose to adapt. One thing that I want to cover really quick before I get into the SCPs that I'm going to be talking about as potentially being picked for adaptation is how the Creative Commons license works. Because of the way that the Creative Commons license works, and the fact that this movie is supposed to be getting a theatrical distribution based on the early articles that were circulating about it, it seems to me that we're not going to get a direct copy of the SCP universe because it would screw up their ability to do distribution. The Creative Commons license essentially means that your work no longer belongs to you in the way that a traditional IP does. And because of that, I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to get something that is exactly like the SCP Wiki. We're much more likely to get something like the web series Containment, where we're getting a lot of featured stories that are similar to entries in the SCP Wiki, but I doubt the term SCP is ever going to be directly used, and whatever shows up will not be able to be a one-to-one adaptation of whatever appears in the wiki. So with that out of the way, I have something slightly different planned for this video. So for this video, I'm going to try something a little bit different. So I have kind of my old Twitch set up here. You can say hi to little Zach down here in the corner. Hi, little Zach. I don't mean that as a euphemism. Don't be weird. For this, I took some of the top 13 entries of the SCP Wiki. I tried to look mostly at Series 1 entries because I felt like Series 1 entries were more likely to be picked for adaptation. I also picked a few things that are from the Containment Breach video game, because I think those are also likely to be things that are picked for adaptation. When you're putting money into adapting things off of the SCP Wiki, you're going to want to be going in with things that are highly well known. And so I think you're going to be looking at mostly things from Series 1, and also a potential of looking at things from Containment Breach broadly. Although anything from these top-rated pages I think is fair game, which is why I used the top-rated pages page on the SCP Wiki. I did skip around a little bit for stuff that I felt was somewhat unlikely. I thought this entry for SCP-4000 required way too much inside baseball to actually understand what's going on. And there are a few highly rated pages like that that actually do require you to have a lot of knowledge going in of how SCP works. And so I think anything in that category is so unlikely to be adapted that I did not even pick it. I wanted to pick things that I felt like at least had a slight chance. You'll see that I put up 6 categories. The first one is basically guaranteed. There's a few that'll go up here. Highly likely, stuff that I think is, based on these top rated pages, I think will probably be making it into the movie. 50-50 shot, I'm mostly looking at things that are well regarded, but I don't see it being adapted for one reason or another. Probably not going to happen. I have a few for this. And lastly, I have you're going to have to adapt it yourself to see it, which is stuff that I think is super unlikely to be adapted for one reason or another. And the last one I have is interstitial bait with a question mark. So in the VHS movies, the way that these movies typically work is it starts off with this main sequence that you're going to watch, and then it cuts away to another movie, and then it will cut back to that original sequence after each short film. And those are what you call an interstitial when you're talking about a horror anthology. There are a few different SCPs that I think could be used as an interstitial. The biggest one is SCP-93. Because it involves multiple tests where you're going to an alternate reality, I felt like each test would make a really good use of interstitial. I also think that that SCP is far too long to adapt. Otherwise, it would be like a good 20 or 30-minute chunk of the movie by itself. So let's start with SCP-173. I'm putting that in basically guaranteed right away. I don't even have to really think about it. This is the first ever SCP article, and it's a fairly generic concept in horror, so I think it's pretty likely to make it into the adaptation. Now, if you don't know about this one in particular, this design was stolen from an artist without asking for permission and then branded under the Creative Commons license, which is like a huge, taking that image without asking for it and then putting it under the Creative Commons license was a huge screw up on the part of the early SCP wiki, and it could have gotten them in a lot of trouble if the artist had not been so nice about it. And so you're not going to see the iconic peanut statue, but I think you're basically guaranteed to see a moving statue that breaks people's necks at some point during the SCP VHS series. So the next one that I have is the SCP entry that on the top rated pages is just a bunch of dots. And that is this image right here. I am going to put this in probably not gonna happen. This article really only works because of its format. If you click on it right here, you can see the format. It is an anti-meme that is an actual creature that tries to absorb knowledge about it, and it will only do it to information about itself that is not an image or a warning sign or anything like that. It really only works well because of the format, and it's highly rated because of the format, and because of that, I think it's pretty unlikely to be picked for an adaptation. There are a couple other SCPs that work really well because they're format bending. The other one that I'm thinking of is SCP-5999, which is a story about how the viewer, well, I don't want to give it away, but it is metatextual in a way that is not really going to work for an adaptation. It's one you should definitely read yourself, though. If you like these articles, I highly recommend 5999. Very good article, very well written, and an interesting take on the wiki itself. All right, the next one that I have is SCP-49 in my notes. I'm a little iffy about 49. I think that you're somewhat likely to see it because the article is largely done as a series of interviews with the subject, which is the subject is the creature here, and then talking about some of the aftermath of some of their tests, and also talking about what he does with the subjects that they bring him. I think that if we see it, it's likely to be as the interstitial, potentially, but I think it could also work by itself, so I'm going to put it in highly likely. I was kind of iffy about that one, where to put it exactly, but I think you're probably going to see that one in some way or another. Actually, you know what? I'll move it up to basically guaranteed. I think you're basically guaranteed to see something with a Plague Doctor mask because it's generic enough to not really need a lot of rewrites or anything with a Creative Commons license. But at the same time, I'm not really sure whether you're going to see it as a short film by itself or as the interstitial between the other films. Next, I have SCP-96, also known as the Shy Guy in the fandom. This has already been adapted by the fandom in a pretty good adaptation, if I'm remembering correctly. I remember kind of liking it when I watched it. So if we don't see this one, I think it's largely going to be because it's already been adapted. But because it's already been adapted, I do think there's a chance that we don't see it. Because the way that this SCP works is that it always tends to break containment when its image is seen by someone outside of the facility. It does lead to a lot of cool scenes where it breaks containment, kills a bunch of people, and then people have to be amnesticized or renditioned to D-class. I've seen it used in Broken Masquerade stories before, which is what it's called in universe, when the existence of the SCP Foundation is revealed to the general public, which is actually taken from Vampire Masquerade, which is another thing that really lets you know that the SCP Wiki has its origins in 4chan, because 4chan also had a traditional gaming forum. But I think it's highly likely that you're going to see it. The only thing that gives me some pause is the fact that it's been in its own adaptations already. Actually, I actually might downgrade it to 50/50 shot because of that. I do think that it's a good possibility that you'll see it because it's so iconic, but at the same time, there are a lot of other iconic SCPs that they could use instead. They're probably going to want to be able to market this on presenting an audience with adaptations of SCPs that haven't been adapted before. And because of that, yeah, I'm going to downgrade it a little bit. I was, in my notes, I had it as more like highly likely, but I think I'm going to downgrade it to 50/50 shot. All right, SCP-55. This is another anti-meme. It's a little bit more doable than the dot-based SCP, but I'm not sure how much doable it is. A lot of these anti-meme SCPs are about something that kind of rewrites reality or struggles to be known. The thing that I'm wondering is how much of a creature feature film this exactly is going to be. If they're trying to make sure that they only do like 1 or 2 creature feature SCPs, then I think you're more likely to see that. And if not, if they're very comfortable doing these creature feature SCPs, I think you're more likely going to see it in the probably not going to happen category. But I think we're probably gonna see at least one anti-meme SCP because of the big anti-memetics division novel that's fairly popular. So even though it's gonna be kind of hard to do, I'm gonna move it to 50/50 shot. Just the difficulty of shooting something like this is the only thing that kind of gives me pause about whether it's going to be in this or not. All right, SCP-682 is next on my list. It fits great with the creature feature vibes, again, that the VHS series does often for a lot of their shorts. It doesn't really have baggage of being associated with things that would be hard to explain to an audience. It's just a lizard that's so hard to kill that it shows up as kind of an undead zombie lizard. And it will be interesting to see how it would be depicted on film, because it's usually depicted in like a half-dead state. This one I'm gonna put in, we're gonna go with highly likely. I think you're gonna get at least 2 creature-based stories in the SCP VHS entry in the franchise, and I would be shocked if we didn't get both the neck-breaking statue that is similar to the Weeping Angels and the hard-to-kill lizard. I think you're pretty likely to see both of those. It also depends on how much they really want to go with a more humanized creature. And I'll get to that a little bit later when I'll get to a more human take on the creatures with SCP-106, which I think is also a pretty likely inclusion. Next, I have on my list SCP-5000, also known as Y. SCP-5000 is about a recording attached to an exoskeleton survival suit. The survival suit ends up in the Foundation's hands from another reality, where the Foundation decides to kill humanity because humanity is being manipulated by a force that could not possibly be contained. And so they have decided that the only way to contain this threat is to kill all of humanity. It is a very popular SCP entry because it involves the Foundation unleashing many, if not all, of the creatures and various baddies that they have contained. Not the fun kind of baddies, the other kind of baddies. I almost want to say basically guaranteed. The reason for that is this is a really good way to include nods to any of the stories that you wanted to talk about but didn't feel like merited their own full entry in the series. Because of that, I feel like we might see an adaptation of Y. Guarantee you it won't be as long as the actual SCP article, but because of that, we move it down to highly likely. What are we thinking, chat? There's no chat here, it's just me. I'm gonna go with highly likely. I don't think it would be a good one for interstitials. It could maybe be one for interstitials, but I think you're more likely to see it as the very last short film in the anthology, that kind of gives a nod to everything that they wanted to include, but were not able to put in its own full-length video. All right, SCP-87 is the stairwell that keeps going down further and further and kind of defies physics and is big in the early liminal spaces movement in internet horror. And because of that, it is basically guaranteed. The entire reason that they even commissioned this movie is off of the success of the Backrooms movie with Kane Parsons. And because of that, I basically have to concede that they're going to do some kind of liminal spaces SCP. 87 is the highest rated liminal spaces SCP. It may not necessarily be the most famous one, though, because there's one from Containment Breach, the Recursive Hallways, which is SCP-970, that is also really famous. I think because of that, if you don't get SCP-87, you're going to get SCP-970, but you're going to see one of those two ones in this movie almost no matter what. And because of that, I'm putting it in basically guaranteed with like the asterisk of if it's not this one, it's going to be the other one. And I would say it's even more likely to probably be included than 55, actually. So I'm going to kind of move that down in the basically guaranteed tier list because you're going to see one of these. The Liminal Spaces movement was kicked off in internet horror. This movie got commissioned because of a Liminal Spaces movie. You're going to see one of the two Liminal Spaces SCPs. Now, there's one that I think that you're going to have to adapt it yourself if you want to see it, and that is SCP-3008. I think SCP-3008 is tied very closely conceptually with the Backrooms. It's the IKEA showroom that goes on for forever. I would rate this as a less likely inclusion. I would rate this one as a less likely inclusion than SCP-87 and SCP-970 for two big reasons. The first is that I think the movie is going to be more likely to favor things that are from Series 1 or come directly from Containment Breach. The other is that this story in particular is really reliant on references to IKEA and the idea that IKEA showroom layouts are difficult to find your way around in and also are kind of this liminal space of they're set up to look like how the furniture would look in your home, but it's not a home, it's a showroom. Even the third reason that I think you're unlikely to see this is the Backrooms film itself took place in a furniture store. And so you're basically just remaking Parsons' Backrooms one for one if you include the never-ending IKEA. And because of that, I think as far as alternative reality spaces go, that's not one that you're very likely to see. All right, next on my list, I have SCP-106. This is another classic that kind of comes from the Containment Breach era yet again, and it's where I think most of those shorts are going to come from. I'm going to put it in highly likely. It fits the creature feature mold. It also could allow you to do a more human telling of that story because there's been some expanded canon stories about how SCP-106 is originally a member of the Foundation that fell in a twisted reality that warped him into the rotting man that is SCP-106. So, you know, I think this one's pretty likely. It might even be more likely than Y if I'm thinking about it, but it's a pretty iconic story, and because of that, I would rate it as pretty likely to show up. Last one from my list, and then I have two to add, is SCP-93. I already talked about this. I think that if it's going to be included, it is interstitial bait. It is going to be the interstitial film of the entirety of the anthology if it makes it in. It is one of my favorites from the Series 1 articles, and I think it's unfortunately too long to receive a proper adaptation in the VHS format. It's famous enough that I could see them taking a single test. Some of the later entries in this are interesting enough that I think that they could be a standalone short video, but I feel like it really works best if you use it as the interstitial and you don't just give us a singular test, because then you're actually getting a narrative that kind of evolves as the story goes on, which is exactly what they really like to do with the interstitials to mixed levels of success, unfortunately. There's two more that I wanted to talk about that are not rated highly enough to quite make the list, but I think are still really iconic for their own reasons, and this makes it a nice even 13, a cool unlucky number. The first is SCP-231, which is the one about the Montauk procedure, which is the dreaded SCP of implied SA. I'm really of two minds about this one, so I'm going to put it in 50-50 shot. I could see it being adapted because of the popularity of Project Montauk and the post Stranger Things world, and the fact that it's an SCP that isn't really related to a creature, which like I said, I think they're going to want to do some that aren't directly related to some kind of creature. If they do, they will probably adapt it in such a way that the implied SA scene is instead about some kind of surgical torture method or something else, which it is vague enough within that SCP article that that could still be a one-to-one adaptation. It's never directly stated, if I'm remembering correctly, that it's about SA, but that is the direction that most people tend to take it in. The last one that I wanted to talk about today is SCP-701, which is the Hanged King's Tragedy, a play that when reenacted causes supernatural elements to occur. This could definitely be used in the exact same way as SCP-231 if the filmmakers find that they do not want to include too many films that are about a creature, then this, I think, is a pretty good inclusion for that. The biggest problem with the Hanged King's Tragedy overall is that the Hanged King's Tragedy works best within the entire canon that talks about the Hanged King. It is one of my favorite canons within the SCP Wiki, but I'm not super sure that it's going to happen. I'm going to probably put it in probably not going to happen. This is the one that I would most like to be wrong about, and I think it's probably more likely than the .scp because it's not format dependent, but overall, without all the stuff about Algata and everything else, basically the Hanged King kind of is an XP of the Yellow King, and without all of the associated trappings that really get into the cosmic horror elements, I don't think that it's going to be as interesting for audiences. Yet at the same time, I'm not really sure that you could include all those things without bogging the entire movie down in elements that aren't going to play really well with the general audience. Because remember, this does want to have a theatrical release. I'm actually going to put 231 ahead of the anti-meme, but other than that, I think this is pretty good. So I had a very annoying sound malfunction, so I'm going back and re-recording this part as I'm editing everything at the very end. I also kind of fixed the annoying collar malfunction as well. But if you have any SCPs that you'd like me to take a look at for the channel, let me know. I'm currently planning on taking a look at the Hanged King canon because it is one of my favorite canons in the SCP Wiki. It takes a kind of stab at how the Foundation would approach cosmic horror, and there's actually quite a few different stories within the Hanged King canon. So I'm going to be looking at a few of those stories. The only holdup on that is I am going to try and finish Robert Chambers as the King in Yellow first. The Hanged King is based very heavily off the King in Yellow, and I want to have had a chance to go back and look at the basis for the Hanged King before I actually cover the Hanged King on the SCP Wiki. Also, if you have any suggestions for things that you think might make the VHS SCP movie, let me know in the comments. I might do another one of these based on some of the buzz for the movie once I see some of the ideas that other people have had for what may be included in the film, but I'm kind of waiting on both comments and really what I see the popular consensus shifting towards as being possible to cover in the movie before I do this again. But it is something that I would consider doing again down the road. I really enjoy the SCP Wiki despite the fact that it's not always the best writing, but I think the high concept stuff from the wiki really begs for adaptation that kind of frees it from the shackles of that overly scientific language that sometimes gets bogged down in details instead of covering the story. But that's it for me for this one, folks. Stay golden out there.